Hello everybody, I hope you're having a great Tuesday. This is August 18th and I wanted to give you a little preview of the module on chemistry of life. So this is going to be a little micro lecture as short as possible. Alright, so these are the learning outcomes, and the purpose of the learning outcomes is for you to be aware of the things that I'm going to expect to have on the exam. So if you can do these things, if you can explain these things, if you can draw these things, if you can just discuss these things, then that will satisfy the requirement that you will need to have for the first test. So this is going to be Module 2, and the first exam will be Modules 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so we start off with atoms. What is an atom? Atom is the smallest unit of matter that has all of its own chemical properties, chemical and physical properties, and the periodic table shows all of the different types of elements. Elements are pure matter, so an atom is just going to be specific for a specific element. And then we understand how atoms are built, are made. They have subatomic particles in them, and they kind of function as a unit, an individual unit, and they have specific properties based on the element. This is showing a helium atom, and there are 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Neutrons have no charge, protons have a positive charge. And then circling around the atomic nucleus, so this is not a cell nucleus, this is different as an atomic nucleus, it's very small. We actually have never seen it. We have seen electrons, we've been able to photograph those. And those circle around trying to get to the positive charged protons, and electrons always have a negative charge. Alright, and just to go over atomic number real quick, that is always going to be the number of protons that are present in an element, and each element has its own unique atomic number. So can you guys tell me what is the atomic number for helium? Dum-da-dum, yes, count them, 1, 2, so the atomic number is going to be 2. Alright, so even though we look at protons for their atomic number and we look at neutrons, and not every element has a neutron, hydrogen does not have any neutrons. It's the first element that was formed in the universe, so it has no neutrons, and it's relatively small, relatively light. But electrons are the ones that actually form all these bonds, whether they're going to be a direct bond by interacting with another electron, so a covalent bond, or whether it's going to be more of a direct interaction through charges, opposite charges of a non-covalent bond. Those are the players in these chemical bonds, and chemical bonds are what form life. And so we are talking about things that build life, and electrons are critical for that. The first electron shell, which is closest to the atomic nucleus, only holds 2 electrons. I don't really know why, but that's the way it works. And you cannot get any more of that. So the first 2 electrons will fill up that shell, electron shell, which is where the electrons move around the atomic nucleus, the location, approximate location. The next 2 shells or orbitals of where the electrons live, the second and third, those can hold a maximum of 8 electrons, so that's what we call the octet rule, like, octopus, legs, 8 legs, kind of thing, octomom. Those all can hold a maximum of 8 electrons. When you get to the 4th and other shells farther away from the atomic nucleus, then those can hold varying amounts of electrons. They're not 8, and they're certainly not 2. Valence shell, I have this bolded so that you can just know that it is the outermost electron shell which is not filled, and that's where the electrons are going to be borrowed or shared from other atoms, so that outermost shell can be filled. Everybody wants to be happy, everybody wants to be full, so do electrons, so do atoms with the right amount of electrons, and so this is really the basis of what these chemical bonds are all about. So this is the hydrogen atom. As I said, it's a quite simple element. It was the first element that was formed in the universe. And you can see it only has a single proton in its atomic nucleus, and it has a single electron, so those charges balance. All atoms in the periodic table are going to be balanced. That means that the number of electrons are going to equal the number of protons. In this case, it's 1 and 1. And so if you add those 2 together, you get a net no charge. So the number of electrons that hydrogen wants to have is going to be 2. It only has 1. So it's an excellent candidate to take that 1 electron, share it with somebody else so that everybody can get their 2. And that's what it's looking to do. And so hydrogen is going to always want to form a covalent bond with somebody else. How many covalent bonds can each atom of hydrogen make? Only 1, because it only needs 1 more electron here, so it can only make a single bond. Okay, covalent bonds are when electrons are shared with other atoms. So that's that sharing to fill that outermost valence shell. So here we've got 2 atoms of oxygen. You can see that they have 6 electrons. So what we haven't shown here, because the atomic number for oxygen is 8, we have not shown the 2 innermost electrons. They're not going to be involved in any kind of chemical bonds. But we can see that outermost valence shell is not full. It wants to have 8. It only has 6. It makes a great candidate to share electrons with somebody else. It can certainly share electrons with its own, another atom of its own kind. And so here we can see that we actually have sharing of 2 electrons. So they form a double bond. So diatomic oxygen, which you're breathing in right now, hopefully, is always going to have 2 covalent bonds between the 2 oxygen atoms. A polar covalent bond is an unequal sharing of electrons. A water molecule is an excellent example. Please remember that these solid lines are showing the sharing of electron from this hydrogen atom to this oxygen atom, and so that's represented by a solid line. And because there's an unequal sharing, so that little electron being shared by the hydrogen tends to circulate around this oxygen atom more, allowing it to kind of seem like the electron is living over here more than over here. It's not a full transfer, so it's not an ion, but it's an unequal sharing, and so that this oxygen atom looks like it has a partial negative charge, and the hydrogen atom looks like it's kind of lost its electron, so it looks like it's a partial positive charge. Same thing with an ammonia molecule. You've got, here's the nitrogen in the center, and these are the hydrogen atoms on the outside. And again, it's a solid line showing a covalent bond between the hydrogen and the nitrogen. But because the nitrogen is more electronegative than the hydrogens, it looks like it's got a partial negative charge, and the hydrogen atoms look like they have a partial positive charge. And these are just some, let me move this. These are some examples of the polar covalent bonds and what they look like. They're always going to be polar, and we're going to, that polarity sets up the ability to have certain chemical properties. If you are nonpolar, you have other certain chemical properties where you can't interact with polar things. You can only interact with nonpolar things. And then, again, this is another example of a polar covalent bond, carbon dioxide. Here for this one, CO2 is going to be a nonpolar molecule. All right, so that leads us into hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are a non-covalent bond. So non, that means not covalent, not due to sharing of electrons, but simply due to the attraction of these charges. So you first, for a hydrogen bond to happen, that hydrogen first has to be in a polar covalent bond, period. Once it's in a polar covalent bond, it'll have a net positive charge. That net positive charge will be attractive to other negative charges, and it'll want to interact with them. And I have a little diagram here on the next slide. So here is water molecule 1, water molecule 2, water molecule 3. And here's that hydrogen. It's in a polar covalent bond with this oxygen, so that makes it partially positive because it's sharing its electron unequally with the oxygen. It's not letting go. And now we have kind of a dotted line here. That dotted line is showing this hydrogen partially positive being attracted to that partially negative oxygen. So a hydrogen bond is always represented by a dotted line, and that is due to attraction of a positive, partial positive, to a full-on negative or a partially negative charge. And that, you're saying, well, that's really kind of a weak bond. Well, you're right, it is a weak bond, but it is still enough to be attracted to that these two are attracted to each other. And they stick together, and that's why water is so sticky, so cohesive, is these hydrogen bonds make it that way. Okay, so if you think extreme case with this unequal sharing of electron bonds, that's how you can form an ionic bond, because if the attraction is strong enough from one atom to the next, there can actually be a ripping away or a movement of the electron from one atom, if it can lose its electron, to another atom, which can gain the electron. So the transfer of electrons forms ions, and those ions then can be attracted with each other, and I'll show you an example of that. So here we have, let's go up here. Here we have a sodium ion. You can see this is just the valence shell, so that outermost, that third, the atomic number for sodium is 11. So that third electron shell has only a single electron. Well, it can lose an electron pretty easily and still be pretty happy because it's still got 10 here. But when it loses its electron because somebody comes along and steals it, it's going to still have its 11 protons in the nucleus. Thus, it has one extra proton in its nucleus, and it has one less electron in its orbital shells. And so, therefore, it has a net positive charge, and that's why we write a +1 here. And chlorine, once it takes the electron, it forms an ion, forms a sodium ion, and it takes it for itself. It wanted to have 8 in its outermost shell, and indeed it now does. And so it has one extra electron than it had before. It still has 17 protons, but now it has 18 electrons. And so that's why it has a net negative charge. And I hope I just said that right. 18 electrons, 17 protons. It has one negative charge. And that between the two, now you're going like, well, I don't see anything between it. Well, sometimes they draw kind of like 3 lines here, but here this positive charge on the sodium ion is attracted to the negative charge on the chlorine ion, which now changes its name to chloride. So that's a chloride anion and a sodium cation. Functional groups are molecules which are associated with atoms, which carbon atoms, carbon molecules, which actually change the overall chemical properties. And there are several that you need to know: hydroxyl, methyl, carboxyl, amino, phosphate, carbonyl, and sulfhydryl. And I've kind of talked about what each one of them do. These are actually, well, this will come up, these amino groups, carboxyl groups, this will come up when we talk about amino acids. Methyl groups, that's really, you see a lot of that on amino acids. You also see it on fats, because fats are very nonpolar, so nonpolar means carbons and hydrogens. Phosphate groups are definitely part of DNA and RNA, also modifications to proteins. And so that's going to be a phosphorus with lots of oxygen, so very charged. Sulfhydryls are important in amino acids, and they form disulfide bridges, and so this SH group is actually important for formation of covalent bonds. So these all allow properties to be formed in molecules, so that's why you were given that. The pH scale is, you guys are familiar with the pH scale. When you're low, have a low number of your pH scale, then you're going to have a high amount of hydrogen ions, because the pH just measures the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. When you have a very high pH number, you have a very low amount of hydrogen ions. And so that is going to be, so that because this scale is logarithmic and it's to the negative, so to the negative 14, and so it's going to be a very low amount of hydrogen ions. Buffers are molecules that can absorb hydrogens or hydroxyls, so that you can modify the pH so that it doesn't change very much, because proteins do not like to be exposed to either acids or bases. They like to be in a very neutral environment in general. Finally, we come to the laws of thermodynamics, the first and second. The first law is that energy just is. It has been created and it cannot be created or destroyed. And then the next one is that order, everything goes from an ordered to a disordered form of energy. And that's it.